Hello and welcome to the webinar, our basic restricted materials compliance and practice. My name is Bruce Calder. I'm the VP of Consulting Services here at Claigan. It's going to be pretty busy. We have quite a packed agenda and a lot of attendees. I'm going to try to get through everything I can. It should go for about 50 minutes, and there should be about 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit it below, and I'll try to get to as many as possible at the end. The format of the webinar controller is a little bit different than you had before, but just put it in the questions section or the chat section, and I'll get to as many as I can at the end. So we're going to have a little introduction, and then we're going to talk about restricted materials regulations, sort of the simple ones, and then complying with the simple ones, the straightforward ones, the ones you know, and then talk about some of the esoteric ones, which are actually probably more important, and then talk about change, how regulations are changing, in much more practical sense. And then the real focus here is, how do you do it? How do you comply to these regulations that are changing, that are complicated, that may not be straightforward for you or your suppliers? And we'll talk a little bit about data, and we'll talk primarily about focusing on outputs. Whenever you deal with us on compliance, one of the things we always come back to is, what is your outputs? We're going to try to be very tangible what we're talking about. You want to focus on your outputs and then work your process towards those outputs. Then we're going to talk about the concept of core compliance. This is a very, very important, effective, practical concept. The idea of creating core compliance, especially for legacy products. You can't do everything. You don't have infinite resources. You don't have infinite time. Your suppliers don't have infinite knowledge. How do you create a core set of compliance and core documents that you can use or leverage for a much wider product portfolio? And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways we do it. And then we'll talk about things like new product design and how to better manage it going forward. You really, at most companies, really have two sets of products. Ones they've already made and ones they're going to make. And they're a bit different. So once they've already been designed and locked in, legacy, it is more difficult to do really comprehensive, proactive compliance. And so we're looking more at a core compliance process. But looking forward, when it's part of new design, moving it up in the design process, make it more incremental, make it more normal, best way to put it, in your design process. Make it a lot easier. Move it up front. Don't make it a fire drill at the end of product design. So we're going to talk about all these things. It should take about 50 minutes. Hopefully it's 10 minutes of Q&A. If you have any questions during, you just put them in the question section. I'll try to get to as many as possible. If the question section doesn't work, so it's a new format, feel free to put it in the chat section. So we do a tremendous amount of stuff. Of course, we do the new MDR, we do RoHS, REACH SVHC, EU POP, the REACH Article 67 restrictions, Prop 65, US FDA Health Canada restrictions, and tons of others. So we're very specific. Everything we're talking about today is how you actually do it. We've done compliance for thousands, if not more, products. We have a lot of experience. We're going to talk about how you really do it in a situation where you need to be compliant and you want to sell. You don't have infinite resources and you don't have infinite time. One of the big things that makes us different than most companies is we focus on compliance. You're doing this not for fun. You're doing this because you have to comply to something. And what are the end deliverables? And anything that doesn't contribute to being compliant or those end deliverables then needs to be justified or cut out. We really want to focus on, what is your output? For compliance, for this regulation, this is my output. Perfect. What's the best way to get there? Just because somebody's trying to sell you something doesn't mean it's the best way to get there. What is the best way to get there? So, a lot of global restricted materials requirements. A lot of people know these ones. So you have global sales, you have global restricted materials requirements. We're looking at RoHS 2 and the new RoHS 3, the phthalate restrictions. REACH SVHC communication, the REACH Article 67 restrictions, which are one of the most common sources of recalls in Europe. We're talking about Prop 65, which is really ratchet up prosecutions. It was doing about 150 a month, and its last couple of months about 220 or 250 prosecutions a month. It's really ratcheted up. The new EU medical device regulation around carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxins, endocrine disruptors, sensitizers, allergens, how to manage that. China RoHS, Taiwan RoHS, these are ones that people generally know and may not know perfectly well, but at least have a good functional knowledge. But these are actually quite a range of ones that normally apply to most global products. They're selling products globally. These are very common ones that apply to pretty well everyone. Medical devices, obviously just them. Taiwan RoHS has some restricted scope, but otherwise these are fairly comprehensive in affecting most global products. And a lot of people are fairly aware of these, but they are quite diverse and quite complicated to meet. However, there are much more esoteric requirements. So now we have the standard ones, but you still have a lot of esoteric stuff. So new stuff, or stuff that you may not be familiar with, and believe it or not, is probably more important than the ones we just talked about. The leader being the EU persistent organic pollutant, you have a larger chance of having a stop ship in North America or Europe for a POP than for RoHS. It's a big deal. A lot of people don't realize that one. This one's actually a really big deal. The chance of a stop ship for this, especially in Canada or Europe, is much higher than RoHS, and far more common than an RoHS stop ship. Swedish flame retardant tax. People are not necessarily aware of this. This is really mostly around consumer products, but it's a big deal. If you can't produce the information on what flame retardants you're using, you get taxed. Not restricted, just taxed. It's fairly new, very effective from a government perspective, because the burden is on the manufacturer, because otherwise you pay the tax unless you can prove otherwise. iMerc, a lot of companies don't realize in the US, if you have any mercury in your products, whether it's a mercury light bulb or it's a puffy sticker, which very commonly have mercury blowing agent, the polyurethane foam, you have to register in Vermont for the US, and you actually need to label the product. The Canadian prohibition of certain toxic substances, which is radically difficult and very complicated to understand. It's written by lawyers, I think, speaking gibberish. Inside of that, there's a key restriction to a chemical called short-chain chlorinated paraffins, also called short-chain chlorinated alkanes. It's a persistent organic pollutant. It is probably your most likely chance of a stop ship in North America. So we're looking like, oh, in the restricted materials, I have Prop C5, which can be very painful, but there aren't any stop ship issues. Oh, yes, there is. Canada's got one, and boy, do they want to enforce this one. They have a very, very strong enforcement agency on that one. Not anything else, but that one. The Canadian Section 71 mandatory surveys. Canada's a little bit weird in the way they do things, but they have mandatory surveys. There's 2 ongoing right now. They have to provide chemical information as part of importing products into Canada. And the one not everybody's familiar with, but it's a very, very important one in the shipping industry. If you're going to sell products that go into ships, you have to be able to do the inventory of hazardous materials. So this is very broad. A lot of companies run into these, or suddenly run into these, or decide, hey, we're going to make a sale, and it's going to go on to these guys, and they need IHM. Oh, there's no sale. So we're going to explain how you do these. And so these ones are a bit esoteric, and commonly when you're probably dealing with somebody who might be trying to sell you something, they try to put everything up on the page. No, really, these ones actually are, for the most part, more likely even to cause a stop ship than the ones in the previous page that you already know. So how do you comply with all this? The ones you do know that are quite broad and varied, and then some of these more esoteric ones you may or may not have heard of before, but actually a big deal. Well, the other thing is, what we just talked about is wonderful, and you might have just seen something new. Everything's changing. So REACH SVHC, everybody says, yeah, REACH can be updated every 6 months. And this is the best part. When EU Commission has a ruling, we already had one of these. The REACH is now going to update every 6 months and at random intervals. You're like, well, they can't do that. Well, actually, they can. What it is the normal process that you and I and everybody else is used to is a 6 months, every consultation every 6 months. There's another one coming up momentarily. Whereas somewhere in June or December, they come out with a list of substances that will now be added to the SVHC list you need to declare. That isn't the sum and total of it. What actually happens is, just before that date, so earlier December and earlier June, the member state committee, the MSC, gets together and votes on whether or not a specific substance meets the criteria to go on the list, whether or not it's a Category 1 CMR or a persistent organic pollutant or an endocrine disruptor. If they're unanimous, it goes up. If they're not, it's not off the table. And a lot of people think, okay, it didn't get on this time. So for example, back, I think in January, the low molecular weight phthalates didn't get on the list as endocrine disruptors. But it's not off the table. If the majority still votes for it, it goes to the EU Commission for a ruling. Once the EU Commission rules, they can pop back on the list. And we had that with the 4 phthalates. Now, they're already on the DHP and such, already on the SVHC list. So in practice, it didn't make any difference this one time. But they were actually listed by Commission ruling at a different date than their updates. So you're going to see actually SVHC updates every 6 months and on Commission ruling. So you're going to see randomly throughout the year that the EU Commission actually rules on one that wasn't unanimous, and they could pop on the list. So it's actually slightly more random than you're used to. It isn't just 6 months anymore. RoHS 3, of course, RoHS is change in restricted materials for the first time since 2002. We have the new Prop 65 coming in August, plus new substances jumping on fairly regularly. August of next year has the new Prop 65 requirements. And then there's substance discoveries, which is actually in a lot of cases more important than regulatory change, where people have discovered a substance in a location that people haven't been controlling. One of the challenges specifically for data is that a lot of chemicals are buried in other chemicals, especially in plastics, where they declare the plastic but not necessarily the additives. One of the biggest problems right now is bisphenol A. So when people focus on bisphenol A, everybody goes after polycarbonate. And polycarbonate will normally have somewhere under 100 ppm bisphenol A. Flexible PVC will have bisphenol A more often, and it's often at really much higher concentrations. The bisphenol A is often used as an antioxidant in the colorants. It won't appear on any data sheets or data gathering. It's invisible. And it'll be, in the 100 ppm range, but it can also be used as an antioxidant, especially in shiny or glossy PVC, in the PVC itself. And in those cases, it can be well over 1,000 ppm and run into regulatory issues, whether EU, whether Prop 65, etc. So it's a bit of a surprise. Your actual BPA risk is more in flexible PVC than polycarbonate. And these kind of things, the discoveries actually often induce more churn or compliance issues than actually regulatory changes. So how do you handle all this? Things are going to change. The regulations are going to change, sometimes not as predictable as you'd like. And there's going to be chemical discoveries where they've realized that there's actually a substance more and more often, this material, that nobody's really controlled. One of the challenges with data gathering is, and especially if you tried to do more ineffective concepts like full material declaration, things are buried in there. You won't see it. If the supply chain hasn't regulated it before, it's invisible, especially additives. So how do you do this? So is it some regulations, there's some really esoteric, complicated ones, and then things are in flux. So how do you actually do this in practice so you can sell? So before we get into this and talk about change is actually going to accelerate. It's starting to accelerate. You're in the midst of an acceleration section, restricted materials. Up until basically last year or two, virtually every restricted substance you've had to deal with has been restricted in one of these regulations is either carcinogen, causes cancer, or it's a reproductive toxin, causes birth defects or other reproductive harm. So when you're looking at lead or phthalates, deca-BDE, you're looking at a lot of these substances restricted, mercury, cadmium, they're carcinogens and reproductive toxins. What we've seen in many cases, just further regulation of phthalates, further regulation of lead, further regulation of mercury. There are two new categories of restricted materials. Persistent organic pollutants. These are substances that persist in the environment, build up, and eventually cause harm to flora and fauna. And endocrine disruptors. These are substances that are not necessarily reproductive toxins, but they will affect the endocrine system, usually causing an imbalance between the production of testosterone, male, and estradiol, female, leading to attention deficit issues in young males. So these endocrine disrupting substances. So these two new categories, what's so special about the fact there are two new categories is they bring in a lot of other substances that weren't otherwise regulated. So these two new categories are going to represent the majority of the new restricted substances you see over the next 5 years. And you're going to see a lot more regulated, not just more regulation, you see a lot more regulated by adding to, especially in Europe, two new categories of restricted materials. And we're going to see it in more places. Canada in particular is regulating more and more the persistent organic pollutants. They're going to vastly increase the number of restricted substances over the next 5 years. So when you're looking, you've been getting, an extra substance here and there, it's going to accelerate. So how do you manage this? It's going to change. Change is actually going to get faster and more varied. You're going to see more regulations in places. You're going to see more in those regulations. With the now new categories of persistent organic pollutants or POPs or endocrine disruptors or EDCs, you're going to see a lot more substance regulated that weren't regulated before. Nonylphenol ethoxylate, dichlorine plus, things that haven't been regulated before are going to start getting regulation. So how do you do it? So how do you manage an ever-changing, expanding range of regulations? Plus, not to mention your customers' data requests based on their interpretations of the regulations. One of the challenges we find with customer requests saying, hey, I need this data, and in many cases they do need information. It's based on their interpretation, and it may be custom, may be unique. may not quite be correct, and it isn't necessarily aligned with the way you did compliance. So how do you handle this? One, being compliant and meeting governmental or regulatory requirements, and then meeting your customer requests, which in many cases are as important or more important than the regulatory requests themselves. When you get this, I need this data or I have this thing to fill in, how do you actually do that? And a lot of people we work with in your roles, in restricted materials compliance or quality or regulatory or engineering, these customer requests actually do make up a reasonable amount of the churn. On the bright side, they often get, because they're often sales related to it, they do often get management's motivation, help prod them along. They need to do something, but they're not easy, especially if they don't align with the regulations or necessarily what you've done, or they make no sense at all. We're going to talk about some of that in a bit. So how do you do it? For that, get into that. One, there's sort of fundamental things you like to keep in mind. So when in doubt, you can always come back to these 3 rules. And it's an important thing to know. There are 3 fundamental rules of restricted materials compliance. It is much easier to get data before you buy something than afterwards. It's much easier to get it. One of the main reasons, of course, is your counterpart. It's easier for him to justify to his management, et cetera, to spend effort or time if a sale is related to it. But also they have more ability to meet it because they can put it in their specifications or ask their suppliers for it. So it's much, much easier to get data before you buy something than afterwards. It's a very fundamental thing. The restricted materials prime could do anything they want as long as it's free. So people here probably in this space could do anything they want, but if it costs money, there are challenges. So how do you manage that? And the things you're most likely to be non-compliant for are the things you didn't know about. Not everybody here might know about the SCCP requirement. It's a big deal. It's actually a very significantly big deal. It'll give you a stop ship in the EU and Canada. Straight up. It's not, and there isn't much for exemption there. It's pretty well stop ship. So the things you're most likely to be non-compliant for are the things you didn't know about, which is very true. If you didn't know about it, you're a lot less likely to be compliant to it. So a lot of what we're going to talk about that you never, whatever you do, these are always pretty fundamental things you have to get back to. And this has a lot to do with the practical side. In particular, number 2, where you can do anything you want as long as it's free. Second, it isn't free. It becomes challenging, which most of this is. So data. Gather, so a lot of people, well, we're just going to gather data from suppliers. So we're going to talk about this a lot, going, gathering data from suppliers after the fact is not really effective. If it's not part of the specification of purchasing terms, they don't likely have it, nor the motivation to complete it. And if it wasn't up there from the specification, they didn't control it for this in the first place. And they didn't flow it down to their suppliers. And it's very difficult for them to commit something binding and say, hey, do you comply to these things? Well, when you bought it, you didn't ask for these things, so I can't guarantee that I did this. And especially when you're trying to gather data from 100% of suppliers, it's quite difficult because you need to be compliant. And if you have big gaps, which for this reason you'll often have, and the data may not be truthful in the first place, what normally happens for people who are trying to use data, especially data exclusively for compliance, it takes a really long time to find out it does not work. So you need a better, a more effective, more practical approach. One thing that really drives nuts about especially data-only solutions or approaches, it takes a really long time to find out that it doesn't work. So how do you actually do this in practice? You're not doing this for fun. You need to be compliant. You want to sell product. You want to meet customer demands and move along. You want to focus on the output. And one of the ways to really sort of internalize this, think of this as making soup. You don't go and buy a bunch of ingredients and then come home and figure out what soup you're making. And what you really want to do is you figure out what your output is. I want to make chicken soup. Awesome. Chicken noodle soup. What do I need to do that? You always want to figure out what your output is first. Do I need soup or should I get a salad with that? And one of the things also, a lot of people go, okay, why don't we do data for everything? Why don't we gather data for all the requirements right up front? Then we'll be compliant for everything. That's like saying, I've never made soup before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make 10 different types in my first try. I'm going to make 10 different types of soups for 500 people. It's not a really good plan. You really want to look at the outputs. You want to look at what soup are you going to make? What are you going to put into that soup? What's the best way to get that soup? So for example, looking at outputs and restricted materials, for RoHS, you need a product without the restricted materials. You need a technical file. Awesome. REACH, you need a substance communication. You don't need data for REACH. You need a substance communication. The only thing you need for each SVHC is that communication. Whatever gets you there, gets you there. That's actually the output. Prop C5, you need the warning. However you get to that. China RoHS, you need the table and label. Most of the table from a technical perspective. What's the best way to get there? So the first thing you always have to do is basically figure out what soup you're going to make first. What is your output? Then figure out how to get there. It's really interesting for us, for people that I'm going to go and gather data on these regulations. First thing you have to do is figure out what you're going to make. What's your output? Best way to get there. Go and get data for everything? Oh God, no. Just make a bowl for a soup for yourself before feeding it to others. A good example of it for us is create those declarations for a product. Figure out, did it work? Would you do it differently next time? Is there a better way to do it? And how do and the work I did, does it cover similar products? For example, you make soup and you might find out that I actually don't have a ladle. I really need a ladle. It's a good thing I'm not doing 50 once here. Or you know what? If I'm doing chicken noodle or minestrone, I still need chicken broth. There's a lot of commonality. If I'm making salad, it turns out they need the same lettuce. How can you leverage them across? You really want to make one first. It's funny that the way a lot of people handle restricted materials is compliance. It's often so different from how they handle anything else in life. Go back and look at it. You want to create an output. Figure out what your output is, and then create it for a product. And then go back and say, what did I learn from this? What was the best way? Is there a better way to do this? Is there a faster way to do this? Is what I did here, do you know what? I did product X, but could this cover product Y mostly? Or what do I have to do that's really different? So you create one output first, and then look at other products. It's a much more effective way to do it. You really want to look at what is my output, create one, then go back, okay, did it work? What would I do differently next time? Is there a better way to do it? How much does this cover similar products? What I did for this model, kind of half it covers the rest of the products. So what do I do from there? So it's very much create the output for one product. I've created the technical file or the declaration. Great, I figured out how to get here. You know what? I'm going to do it this way this time, or what I really need is this buy-in, or this one made things life easier. And then start looking at other products. Core compliance. We love the idea of core compliance. We create core compliance information to leverage for a larger range of products. You can't solve everything all the time right away. Your supply chain won't be that qualified anyways, let alone you're necessarily any particular person's knowledge is not necessarily 100% comprehensive. So we're a big fan of creating core compliance. What are the fundamental things you need that you can use for other stuff? And then focus on example products. We'll talk about that for the core regulations. So what core regulations cover the best range? I mean, if I get these 3 or 4 done, or the output's done, how much of it can be leverageable for the other ones? Because there's a lot of similarity. Materials have a lot of similarity. As we talked about in the first part, most restricted materials up until now are carcinogens, reproductive toxins. The same materials, more or less, are restricted over and over again. And the same thing you see for persistent organic pollutants and endocrine disruptors. It's the same subgroups. It's a new groups of substances, but they'll be regulated, more and more regulations. It's just variations. So you take this and you focus on some example products. You don't try to solve everything at once. So once you do one, and then you look at doing example products and create the core documentation. And so often one of the best ones set to do core starting point is RoHS, Reach SVHC, and Prop C5, the declaration conformity / compliant product tech file for RoHS, the substance declaration for Reach SVHC, and the warning for Prop C5. The data set there, whether you know it or not, and they're not quite the same limits, but a lot of the same data set, very good overlap, actually is pretty good, and there's a lot of overlap with the Reach Article 67 restrictions, EU persistent organic pollutants, SECP, the Canadian prohibition, and many others. By doing these, you get a good chunk of the others. It doesn't necessarily mean it's 100% coverage, but it's actually pretty decent, especially if you know what you're doing. And so if you focus on these core ones, you can't, so again, the restricted materials prime could do anything they want as long as it's free. This is not. So therefore, what's the most effective way? And usually we go after a core set, especially for legacy products. You can do different things for new designs, and we'll talk about that. But core, you got to start with, I need to be compliant today, not years from now, not esoterically. This is actually part of selling. What's my core? If I focus on these, do I get a good chunk? Not everything, but a good chunk of my compliance. The highest risk, the best coverage, the most leverageable things I can use for more regulations. Cadmium is a big deal for restriction of Article 67. You know what? It's part of RoHS. There's a lot you can do there. The EU POP I mentioned earlier, there's a stop ship risk there. The substance of interest SCCPs is actually REACH SVHC. Prop 65 covers a lot of the materials that can be an Article 67 restriction. There's a lot you can do there. Between those three, you have a very good fundamental basis. And then you can leverage them, especially depending on need. And this is really important for legacy products where you can't fix everything immediately all the time for free. You have to really be practical. Practical, we go after the core set. We want these declarations for these products and then work from there. And we don't try to do it for every. So what you'll end up having is also output. So you'll have this declaration conformity for RoHS. You'll have this REACH SVHC communication. You have this Prop 65 warning. And this gives you set piece corporately approved documents. One of the nice things about going after core outputs is you get the outputs approved internally, everybody agrees they're good, and use them as a response. You get a customer request, I need you to fill this stuff in. You send back your approved documents first, and 90% of the time they are happy. So instead of trying to fill out their form, here's our REACH SVHC, our Prop 65, and RoHS. And when you become more comfortable with POP, you include it with the REACH SVHC stuff. It's far more productive for customer requires, much higher qualities. Believe it or not, the ones you create usually have a process behind it. When you fill in their documentation, you're kind of often guessing and hoping you're doing it right. The quality's not there, the chance of error is there. It's a lot faster. They send you this, you could try to fill in all these things, you can send back your 3 or 4 documents and be good. So it meets a lot of manufacturing normal requirements. It's more productive, it's higher quality, it's faster and less effort. It's cheaper. It's a really good way. Plus, you have the regularized documentation for government require. A lot of people don't realize, starting in October or so, there's a multi-member state enforcement exercise going on REACH SVHC. The big thing you need to be able to provide is REACH SVHC communication or declaration. This is set piece documents. You have it ready to go out. And the other thing about nice core is core documents, it's not perfect. There are gaps. It does have high coverage, but at least it can show due diligence when you make a mistake. By the way, there's going to be tons of mistakes in there. If you have a product, ignoring the circuit board, with more than 1,000 parts, it's not going to be compliant for RoHS most days. The rate of human error we're seeing once you get to higher part counts is such a large influence. You're going to have non-compliant products all the time. Once you get to at least 100 parts is one thing. Once you get near 1,000 parts in a product, the risk of the low percentage human error risk is just, by the time you get to 1,000 parts, is almost 50 to 100% chance you have non-compliance issues regularly. So you're going to have compliance issues whether you've done a great compliance program or pretty good. So the nice thing about the core documents, it also shows due diligence. Look, I know I made a mistake, but I'm doing the right thing. Here it is. And it's more likely to avoid penalties. Basically, well, you're actually doing the right thing. Therefore, fix it on the next. No more shipping until you fix it. But you actually have a program. We're not going to do a public recall or stop ship. Or the economic penalty is far lower in those particular cases. So the core documentation have gaps, but it fundamentally gives you the ability to respond to most inquiries. You have a set piece documents. You'll have the regularized documentation for the government. And if something does go wrong, or when it goes wrong, you have this fallback documentation to show you did work. One of the nice things with outputs is much easier to show the work. Say I collected data. It's hard to show somebody. You see this data in a system. These outputs say, look, I hear my declaration outputs. We did the work. It's obvious. It's not from lack of effort, but it's really complicated stuff you guys got here. And so you're more likely to avoid or massively reduce the effect, the penalty. We also recommend you work on example products. You don't try to solve everything off the bat. You work on the core compliance for example products. You try to find representative products of larger families. For example, you don't try to do every soup at once. You try to do a soup, you try to do a salad, you try to do a roast. And you'll find there's a lot of overlap. A lot of them use, my soups all have carrots and chicken broth. My salads all use the same lettuce and they all have tomatoes. Also, you find out, you know what I'm finding with all this? My problem are radishes. These products have radishes. I got to focus on the radishes. Like flexible PVC and a lot of other products. You'll find that your high risk things, such as flexible PVC or brass or whatever it comes out of it, when you do an example product, what the one material that's giving you a non-compliance risk, you can focus on that on the full family or create warnings for that. So then you create the core compliance documentation, the declarations, those declarations we talked about for those example products, and then take those outputs, my RoHS declaration and tech file, my Reach SVHC declaration, my Privacy 5 warning, and then how far can I move this across the product range? Like what product range? What I'm listing here is what I'm communicating. Would this cover more products? Can I leverage this? Or will cover everything, but this one is a different external power supply. But I just have to work on the external power supply, not everything else. How far can you leverage it? And how far can you leverage your learning? You know what? I've learned things. I've learned that, when I've done all these example products, I'm actually really, my risk is mostly these 5 or 6 materials. If I focus on those, my efforts in that smaller bin have huge dividends. And this is particularly very useful, this example products approach for legacy products that you have a catalog in particular, or they're all built in variations themselves, or it's like there's tons of things there. You don't necessarily have the budget or resources. The other problem with legacy products, they often don't have their own budget for this sort of compliance, or a very limited budget. So it allows you to be more focused on the core requirements of example product, more focused in your approach to get the most compliance you can for the least effort and high quality. The nice thing about focusing, your ability to get higher quality output is quite a bit better. So the compliance documentation you will generate should be a lot better, a lot smoother than if you're trying to do everything at once. So we normally recommend start with large range. And you know what? You're going to find some compliance issues. And therefore, you can figure out whether you have to go deeper or what this means for the product line, as opposed to trying to do everything and not figuring out to way far along you have an issue across the board. So definitely same sort of concept. You focus on your outputs. You focus on your core compliance, core regulations. Start with example products that can represent larger ranges, and then look at expanding that result to a larger product range. Don't try to create everything at once. Don't try to go to the store, buy tons of ingredients, and try to figure out what soup you're going to make, or whether or not you're going to actually make salad. So, be very, very. It's far more effective to start with example products that represent others, do their compliance, and then see what you can leverage. So how do we do it? We actually do it for companies. What we're talking about is we do this all the time. So we have 2 fundamental ways we do it for people. People often send their products to us. They send an example of each product. It's extraordinarily effective. We do review and evaluation testing. We have a fairly extensive test lab here, probably largest volume restriction materials lab in North America. And we do the declarations. And here's all the outputs. This example product is done. And we can look at expanding across more, and we'll talk about that. Or, especially the more bite-sized version, is the on-site or tangible approach. We're going to talk about that one, where we come to you. It's amazing, I think, what we can do in a short period of time, because we have a lot of expertise with you. So the on-site tangible, we call it very tangible because we believe, a situation like this where I'm telling you things is wonderful, and I hope you're retaining it. There'll be a test at the end. Not really, but so I hope you're retaining everything here, but it is difficult. So we're a big fan of tangible, what you can see, what you can touch, what really you will remember. So we come to site, we do a bit of education. It's actually not that long. I'm saying this is the core parts of the regulation. Here are the core regulations. Here's the main salient points. And this is how we're going to get to compliance. And then we're actually going to do it with you. Believe it or not, RoHS is a little bit different, but a lot of the other ones, the other regulations, Reach, Props 5, POPs, you can do a lot of it through evaluation. We know quite a bit. We're going to go with you and explain the high risk. In some of our other webinars, if you want to see the full processes, feel free. We actually do the product evaluation with you. Now, it's not for you, it's with you. We're a big fan of doing it with you. So you have more of a tangible knowledge of what we're doing. We're saying, hey, look, we've taken the product apart, go to high, low risk. Engineering's helped a little bit with identification materials. Here's your high risk materials. Therefore, since Reach is a communication, Props 5 is a warning, and you don't necessarily control those materials anyways in your specification, we're going to declare them. And this is how you declare them. And then if you choose, so after as a business decision, no, we really don't want to have those materials, or we don't want to make sure, then there's more we can do. We can test or data gather those specific materials, not the whole thing, to see if they're really there and then control it going forward. But usually one day, you'll learn, we'll value your products, and you'll come out of it with declarations. You'll actually have tangible outputs that you can provide to customers coming right out of it. It's very, very, very effective. And one of the things, of anything we do, this is easily, I think we get the best reviews afterwards where people say, you know what, I learned a lot. And a lot of cases I actually had fun. Strange enough in this space, I know it's really odd, but actually had learned things. It's interesting. You'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot more than anybody telling you anything. The on-site version will be conducted with your stakeholders, and you might have a larger group than a smaller group if we're doing lots of products that nobody wants to hang around with. But it's very hands-on, tangible. Like, look, we're going to take your product apart and say, this is why this is low risk, this is why it's high risk, this is how you actually do that. Knowing that, not only will you be more tangible, oh, it's this, it further enables you have a better idea how to expand it across product lines. But one thing we really want to do is move compliance in the future forward, up front in the process. Like what a lot of companies do for EMC or electromagnetic compatibility testing, where you take it for granted when they're designing it, the designer puts EMI gaskets in there because they know about the EMC side. You could do the same sort of thing for restricted materials. Often the power cord, if you asked or did design work so it doesn't have the phthalates, it has terephtalates or something else, you could have done that up front and it would save you so much trouble. If you pick this gasket, if you pick this one material over that material, you wouldn't have all these problems afterwards. So the knowledge takes a step. Nobody's going to learn everything in one day or remember everything. Move it farther up front. So we usually very tangible. We talk about the regulations. We talk about the approach for compliance. We actually don't take that long to do it because we'd rather do it. And we actually do this high, low risk and create the declarations. And a lot of it's very tangible. Saying, look, what's going to give you a problem is this gasket. This neoprene gasket is high risk of this material. You don't control it for that, which is perfectly normal. So therefore, we're going to declare it. If you don't want to declare it, then you have to either test it or gather data, and then you have to control it. The fact that this gasket doesn't have DHP, for example, today, but if you don't control it, could tomorrow. So how do you really do that? But not the whole product. We're really focusing on that gasket, that connector, that piece, and not the whole shooting match. It'll also be by people who really know their stuff. We're going to be talking about, what's going to give you grief from a compliance point of view, believe it or not, is going to be sealed bearings. They have a nitrile rubber seal inside them. It's going to be phthalated. It's going to give you regulatory issues. You would never know it's there. So the output is tangible knowledge. Like, you will actually know things, and you want us to retain everything, but that happens. And you'll have, of course, all the slides to go back on, but you'll have some tangible knowledge. But you'll end up with REACH SVHC declarations for those products. Here's a declaration that you could send your customer today. And you'll have the Prop 65 warning recommendation. Look, in absence of doing anything else, this is the warning you put in your product, and based on what the product is, this is where it can go. And there's Prop 65 warnings have a little variation of where they can go between consumer products and professional products. But where exactly can go? And you'll actually have an output. It's the core compliance approach. There are opportunities for gaps, absolutely, but you have the core ones, and you have it very effectively up front. So we do both. The other one is evaluating to us, and this is probably the more in-depth version, and especially when you really want to be more comprehensive. You send it to us, we do the evaluation, testing, and declaration for the example product. And it gives you the baseline. It gives you a test report, we can give you the declarations, and then you can look at, well, is it compliant is one thing, but how I can expand this data across the product line, or use this as a base or supporting documentation, due diligence. The test report is a very nice piece of due diligence that I can use for anything that goes wrong with a wider product family. And then the way we actually structure internally, because the way we manage data and results and the engineering and everything, believe it or not, if things change, it's a relatively straightforward service, is we can actually, you would like to say, hey, I would like these products updated, the new compliance requirements. That's fine. Here's the new report, because there's a lot of it's manipulating, but we have to test another gasket for bisphenol A, we say. But specifically saying, yes, we can update it, but we're going to have to do this, this, and this. Not the whole product all over again. Just these things. Based on the new chemicals, the new regulation, what you want to do there, this is what we have to do. We have a lot of data already. The part that's not already covered is this. This is the one thing or two thing or three things that we're going to have to do together. So also, we get a lot of companies where we do the regulatory work for them. Here are the reports. Here's the example. And then a customer comes like, I need this. And usually, by the way, we recognize it. We know what it is. And we can work with you to create the output. So I know we've done the core. You get somebody like, well, I don't know, a bomb check data request. Bomb check is quite complicated, but it's, for the most part, actually structured in the regulations. You might not know it, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. Sometimes they include a lot more regulations that may apply to your specific product, but the concept is quite strong there, where you can take the fundamental core data and then rearrange it, reprocess it to create the declaration. So anything we have on hand, we can do that for you. So the idea is it's helps mitigate risk of change quite a bit. And you won't know everything all the time. And you don't even have to use that from us. If we've done the report, here it is. You can come back later and ask us, and we have the way we store and manage data and compliance and engineering. There's a lot we can do to update things as things change. So it's one of the big advantages here. Again, we're looking at start with example products. Now, when you get to new products, it's often new designs. So it's usually really easy just to send one to us. It already has its own budget. The project manager probably would normally prefer product managers to checkbox the compliance requirements. So for new products, people send it to us fairly regularly. But looking back at legacy products and looking at example products that represent larger product lines. So then you take whatever data we've done on site, you send to us for testing, and then we try to expand. You want to expand this across product lines. You'll find that the core compliance data, what you've learned here, is usually, to a pretty broad extent, applicable to a larger range of product families. It might not be perfect, but it also gives you some decent due diligence and some baseline information to respond to things. You may have to, in some of your communications, use verbiage and what your declaration is based on. It's based on analysis of an example product, but based on example products, so be honest and truthful in your declaration. But it'll give you tremendous capability. So we want to be able to use the core compliance information for a wider range of products. We want to show, and also to show due diligence to the product. Like, I did something that's not perfect, but we did work here. There's good stuff here. So when a mistake happens, your fallback position is quite strong. In the end, it's very difficult, expensive, time-consuming to complete every compliance detail for every legacy product, especially as they're on the change. By applying core compliance concepts across product lines, an excellent baseline of compliance can be put in place. It's not perfect. Believe it or not, it's extremely effective. And it gets you a quantum leap ahead and higher quality when you focus and you're more focused on your approach. For example, products and core compliance, you'll find the quality is much higher. You're not shotgunning all over the place. You're actually focusing. The quality is much better. The other thing that's really advantageous with this approach, the big advantage, one of the fundamental advantages, you're trying to sell product. It's compliance in weeks, not years. That's a big deal. Your compliance achieved in weeks, not years. Also, for somebody in your roles, one of the challenges with restricted materials compliance for a long compliance cycle is trying to articulate to management, which may have a very 5-second attention span to your stuff, where you're at. And when it drags on, all they usually remember it's dragging on. It's not really good usually for job evolution. So we try to focus on compliance in completing compliance in weeks and creating clear and tangible and useful outputs, which can create tangible outputs. One of the other advantages of tangible outputs, if you have a lot of diverse business units, it's difficult to manage every single one, but what you can set is the objective, saying for your products, you need these outputs. And then you can metric them on a red, green, yellow basis on the output. Do you have your outputs as opposed to sort of a hand wavy thing? And from a management point of view, it's usually a lot easier to say, so-and-so is red, so-and-so is green. And it really, and then they know who to bother. Really simple, especially when they have low attention span, to say, I just want to know what's not working. What do you need me to do? These guys are red because they don't have the outputs. Perfect, bother them. The outputs can also, the core compliance can also be leveraged to meet unexpected or changing requirements without starting again from scratch. So if you focus on the core ones, if you focus especially on those three major ones, RoHS and REACH SVHC and Prop C5, it's not perfect, especially looking at RoHS 3, but you're pretty far along and you can leverage it heavily to meet changing requirements without having to start again from scratch. So it's a big deal. And one of the things we love about it is compliance in weeks, not years. New product design, you manage a little bit differently. Some of the same concepts are useful. For new product design, they have their own budget. What we'd recommend, though, wherever possible, move restricted materials farther up in the design process. Make it a part specification design. Drawing doesn't say RoHS must be RoHS compliant. It's goodness, what happens when the new regulation comes along? Or what you put it must be RoHS compliant in the drawing. Does that include the new RoHS 3? We normally recommend you must be compliant with your company name spec 1, 2, 3, 4, and manage that separately. So you don't have to update the drawing every time. But actually make it part of the drawing specification, like quality or finish or anything else. You want to make it part of the design considerations. Something they choose, materials they choose up front, not a fire drill to replace a part after the design's been completed and ready to ship. Hey, we're ready to ship. You know what? We have a problem with this gasket. We could have solved this if this compliance was up front. And your suppliers are much more likely to be able to comply if they know what they're supposed to be complying with. One of the challenges, the most common challenge we had is you're trying to gather data, find out if they have something, but you never asked for it originally, which is really problematic for a lot of parts and materials, especially if you're trying to go to lower cost. You really want to move the compliance up front so they have a better chance of actually being compliant when they sold to you the first time, as opposed to trying to figure out, do a fire drill afterwards to figure out where they are. One of my favorite ones is a lot of ways people handle EMC, where basically the designer already knows they have to put certain EMI gaskets and considerations and inductors, this, that, and the other thing. Why can't their knowledge be expanded to this? Yes, it's not easy. But move some more of that knowledge up front so they can make decisions that are incremental and basically no cost. There are a lot of restricted materials things, choices you can make up front that don't affect product cost if you only did it originally. And we see more and more of that in the phthalate side for sure. The other thing is, when you do compliance, your specifications, you want to focus on regulations, not a list of chemicals. You don't want to give them this super list of 1,000 chemicals. Why? Chemical lists are very difficult to understand. We manage some chemical lists for a lot of companies. We're pretty strong experts in the field, and we have some trouble understanding them a lot of times. It's difficult. And chemicals can be called more than one thing. And then some of the new chemical ranges like nonylphenol ethoxylates, for REACH SVHC, their individual cast numbers are quite complicated. You wouldn't know one is one family or the other. Your supply chain normally operates by compliance to legislations and standards. They don't work in compliance to certain chemicals. They actually work on compliance to legislation. The parts they buy are compliant to X or Y, not here the chemical listing is. The regulations are also changing constantly, requiring companies compliance to a legislation is far more effective, saying, yeah, their legislation's changing, but our specification, you have to keep complying with it. The fact that we haven't updated our chemical list doesn't make a difference because our requirement is really the regulation. The other huge advantage, it allows work done by a supplier to be beneficial to more than one customer. Whatever you're asking them for, it's something they normally have to provide for anyone else anyways. Or if they're already provided to somebody, it's basically easy for you to get. So it significantly increases the chance you'll actually get the work done or get what you're looking for, but also the quality of it will be much better. It's a common thing. Or they're more motivated to do it because the next guy's going to need it anyways. So very much, we recommend whatever you do for specifications, don't focus on a list of chemicals, focus on the regulations. Now, in certain cases, you might have very, very high-risk materials that represent most of your chance of non-compliance. You might focus on those 2 or 3 in specific circumstances, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to give you grief, get you off the market. But by and large, not using huge lists of chemicals, saying, hey, declare this list of 15 pages of chemicals, which nobody recognizes. Also, we recommend staying away from making unique requests to your customers. Now, custom formats or custom requests or custom data sets, strongly recommend against it. Now, for individual substances that may be super high risk, like lead and brass and some of the phthalates, you may ask for specifically on certain materials, but you're being very focused on this. You're not trying to carpet bomb the universe. One of the big reasons not to do unique requests, unless you're buying over $1 million a year from the supplier, they normally don't have the margin to meet complicated unique requests, which means the cheap parts, which generally cause a lot of the non-compliance, rubber feet, amazing. I would say a third of our non-compliance events are because of rubber feet on the bottom of products, very cheap. It means the cheap parts that cause non-compliance won't get the proper attention anyways. You really want to be asking for something they have to be compliant for anyways. Doing something in addition, unless you're buying a lot from that supplier, which you might be, doesn't have the margin to do it. So the response that you do get one would likely be guesses, just to keep selling. And customer requests are unlikely to be binding, because one of the things is say, hey, you gave me this declaration, turns out you had this. It's much easier to point to them saying, look, this is unique, it's complicated. They can usually argue it if they ever got to a judge, but they won't. They can argue very, like, do you understand this, judge? Like, I have no idea what we're talking about here. So it's going to be very confusing, contradictory. So if you're doing a unique request, it's a lot less likely to be binding. Even if they sign up to it, they can argue afterwards, like, what you're signing was, we signed up to it, but it was very confusing and contradictory. Look where this section contradicted that section. We had to make do. So, but if you focus on regulation, it's much easier. Being compliant to these regulation does not have the same level of confusion, or at least confusion that would be attributable to yourself. In the long run, you want to make this part of the regular process, not an after-the-fact compliance requirement. You want to put restricted materials part of the part specification. You want to, if you want to reduce high-risk materials, you want to do the part of the initial design requirements, not as a fire drill afterwards. You want restricted materials to be part of the engineering change order. When you change a part, having restricted materials is part of that. Don't make it an unnecessarily burdensome part. One of the things a lot of people do is they put restricted materials prime as part of the sign-off, and often because of materials they may not know, and they use us as a reference. Say, look, I'm changing from this polypropylene to this company's polystyrene. Do I have any issues here? And usually we know the answer right away. It's something we see all the time. And you also want to find, say, well, how do I store this data? How do I store these outputs? I don't know. How do you store stuff for safety or EMC? Oh, I have the folder at this level. Put it in the same place. Try to leverage the same compliance approaches used for EMC, electromagnetic compatibility, or safety. Their product level declarations, their safety report, their ESC test report, their declaration conformity. You're already doing that. So why not do the same thing? Why don't you move the REACH SVHC and the RoHS declarations into the same system or approach? It's not part level data. Safety is not captured the part. It's captured at the product level. Put it in the same place. Safety and EMC, you're so used to creating outputs. It's funny that people go to the restricted materials and don't focus on outputs. Focus on outputs and then try to make it as consistent with the other processes so they're done at the same time. They go to the same place. They become not an afterthought. They become a regular process. It makes your life a lot easier. So, big thing that makes us different. Well, that and I speak really fast. Apologize for that. We focus on compliance. You need to be compliant. And end deliverables. You're not doing this for fun. What are end deliverables? Any step or process that doesn't help get to that output needs to be justified. Probably needs to get punted. We want these outputs. Big deal. It's like if we're making soup, I don't need to cut potatoes if there's no potatoes in the soup. So, focus on the end deliverable. Again, I'll get to questions in a second. It's great hosting everybody. And if you have any questions, try to submit it in the questions panel. I think it'll work. Otherwise, you have to try chat. A lot of ways we help companies with this. Very, very popular is the on-site version. It's also it's pretty inexpensive, best learning you'll ever get in a short period of time. We get them there. We give a bit of education. We explain the salient points of the core regulations, how you actually do the compliance, and then we actually do it with you and create declarations. Come out of it something you can use, both knowledge and actually product declarations. The other one we do, extraordinarily effective, is the product evaluation and testing. Definitely, most companies we work with send their new products to us because it's just so much easier for us just to finish them off. But for legacy products, sending us example products, taking the findings, creating core compliance documentation, and then using that or leveraging that across a much larger portfolio. And you'll turn out, you'll find things and you'll fix them. And then you can move along. Well, hopefully you fix them. And then you can move forward. So, any questions, please feel free to submit it. If you need help, please contact us. It's something we do a lot of. Here it goes. For discussion at the end, does the EU Commission ever remove items to the SVHC list if new data supports its removal? Very complicated question. Whether or not it has to go through another revision. The EU doesn't use the courts. Well, actually, the main way that happens, actually, it goes to court, it goes to the European Court, and it gets struck down there. And that's where we see the most movement. Now, the EU Commission, usually it's the Member States Committee, can follow a process to remove it, but it's a bit complicated, and it hasn't been done, so we don't have much knowledge on that. Oh, some comments on the sound. Sorry about that. Is Prop 65 only required to make some warnings on product labeling, or is also a declaration needed? Any restriction? Prop 65 is a warning communication if there's an exposure above exposure limits to the user, whether it's a private citizen or occupational or to the environment. So it's a warning. So there's no declaration per se. There's basically more or less two different types of text that can be on the product. So if it's a consumer product, it has to be on the product or the product packaging or as an insert, some other options, but those are the main ones, one of those. If it's a professional product, it's more open-ended. You have more options as long as you can prove it meets the requirement and it's likely to be seen, read, and understood before exposure. So to complicate a product where they really should read the manual before using, it can be in the manual, but only for professional products. Consumer products don't have that under the new guidance. Now that hasn't gone to court, but under the new guidance from August, you can't put the warning in the manual for consumer products. Professional products is much easier to justify. Any project recommendations regarding a comprehensive approach for standards, regulations, surveillance, as everything constantly changes? So the best one, by far, is us. What we do is, usually for a lot of people it's quarterly, some monthly. We update you. We have a webinar just for you, and it's interactive. You can ask questions, and we talk about what's changed over the past quarter or month, and what you actually do and how it actually impacts your product. We're talking, this month, of course, about the BPA and the REACH SVHC, but we're talking the new PFOA restriction. We're talking about the new BPA settlements for Prop 65. We're talking about the increase in phthalate prosecutions and why Prop 65, the way they use the internet to go after Prop 65, the Section 71 surveys and what actual material is important. We're talking to Chlorine Plus and where it's in your product and where it's going to be restricted. And we have a webinar, but just for you. And it's really inexpensive, and we go over what's changed and ask questions, and it's very interactive. And we find that's the best way where we can distill it down to something practical, and you can ask questions and be much more tangible. So very popular. We do that for 40 some companies right now. We do a lot of it. And the other nice thing, you benefit from feedback from other companies, problems they're going through. It's in some ways, even though it's each webinar, web meeting really is separate, you can benefit from a lot of the communal knowledge of what people run into and find solutions. How would your testing strategy practically work for huge electronic medical devices that consist of hundreds of thousands of components? You recommend testing at all for such complex devices? It depends. It depends a little bit on the regulations. So RoHS, you have to be a little more stringent, so you have to be more comprehensive there. But we test large medical devices all the time. Normally, we test them at your site. So the on-site version we do is very effective. If it's an RoHS point of view, we bring some actual test equipment, but normally we don't use test equipment unless RoHS is involved on on-site, but we come there. And we do a lot of IVD. We do tons of products that are size of large desks of multi-handling, and done literally compliance for thousands of medical devices, including very large medical devices and IVD. And there's some really practical ways, especially when you're focusing on REACH or Prop 65. The on-site one is far more practical way to look at it. Actually, one of the problems the IVD, the big medical device companies are having, is the sheer number of parts. It's not the fact it's hard to be compliant, it's just human error becomes such a big factor. Large medical devices and IVD are the ones most likely to have to do incoming inspection or testing, or first article, where one batch was compliant, the next batch wasn't. And it doesn't happen very often, sub 1% of the parts, but if you have thousands of parts, the math is so large that you'll have non-compliance issues all the time. So it's a little bit different for them. So how do we define core compliance? So we focus on what is the core ones for those products. Generally, it's RoHS, Prop 65, and REACH, SVHC. Their core overlap is good. It's not complete. It's good, and the difference between other regulations are often variations. RoHS 3, the phthalates at the homogeneous level. The SVHC, it's at the component level, so slight variations, but there's a tremendous amount of overlap, and you can do a lot to leverage it. So we look at the core regulations. Now, there's some product types, the core regulations have other things because of what they are, so especially if you go into toys or children's products, they're slightly different, but still a tremendous overlap. Brief comments, what you know about our UAE RoHS, really complex, and so what we understand so far, and still a bit in flux, is it from a physical point of view, it's EU RoHS, including exemptions, restrictions. The standards are the same. They're using EN 50581, they're using EN 62321. It's EU RoHS, except it looks like there's a registration part. And the registration part is a little bit confusing because we can see it even in the standards bureau there, that products that already have registration there for safety, it's going to be another checkbox. You have to provide a test report or a technical file when you register. But that's ones that are already registered for safety. Things don't normally register for safety, we don't know. Medical devices will become part of the submission to the Ministry of Health, quite possibly. It's the registration aspect is different for UAE RoHS. Everything else is technically the same. What do you think of IEC 6474 for electronics? It's actually quite broad standard. Some really good stuff on it. The restricted materials list component of it is excellent. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good in terms of these are the core ones in terms of reporting. It is one of the few ways, in theory, to report chemicals as opposed to regulations information that's tangible. However, the full material declaration part of it is junk and misleading. Full material declaration, it's a long story, and I'm going to do a presentation on it sometime, it's not what people think it is. There's a tremendous number of errors. We deal with more non-compliance events because people use full material declaration than anything else. So, other than human error. So UAE, as comes back, is there any testing requirements? It's not clear. It looks like It can be a technical file because they mentioned EN50501. So it's we're talking about Taiwan RoHS, whether or not, not Taiwan, UAE, Taiwan's different. UAE RoHS, whether there's a testing requirement, there's likely a registration requirement. It's more obvious for some. If you submit an RoHS test report, that easily meets it, you can see from the preliminary stuff. But because they mentioned EN50581, a technical file would likely also be sufficient, but it's not clear at this point in time. How about EU MDR and the list of 1,000 substances? How do you manage it? Again, we approach risk. Everything got to manage through risk. MDR, that one, I would say, especially the CMR side, we are the world's expert on how to do in practice. So what you do is you take the category 1, carcinogen, mutagen, reproductive toxin. So for those who aren't doing medical device regulation, oversimplification, vast oversimplification, materials that are invasive or touch fluid that goes into the human body or gas that goes into the human body, oversimplification. If it's got a category 1 known to cause carcinogen, mutagen, or reproductive toxin above 1,000 ppm, you have to do a variety of things, including justifying it as part of the product registration, but also labeling and other communication requirements. So you're really looking at category 1 CMRs and endocrine disruptors. As endocrine disruptors are part of MDR, as I mentioned earlier, endocrine disruptors are going to be one of the 2 new families of restricted material substances. You're going to see more and more endocrine disruptor restriction. So how do you manage it? First of all, on the CMR side, it's not 1,000 applicable substances. The huge number of them, and we've been through it many times, are petroleum products or nickel salts, or they're monomers inside polymers. The monomers won't equal 1,000 ppm. And for the most part, if they were a CMR, a category 1 CMR, known to cause cancer, mutation, reproductive toxin, and likely to be in a product, they'd already be on the REACH SVHC list or RoHS, which is true. So with a few exceptions, almost every chemical that's reasonably likely to be in the product, outside really exotic products like stents and some of the coatings on stents, outside of some real exotics, but things you're more likely to know what's in it, you're really looking at RoHS, REACH SVHC, Prop 5 substances, plus a few others, beryllium and a few others, beryllium copper. But it is far more manageable. And so we do MDR quite a bit. You have to be somewhat strategic. There are other parts of the MDR that are very complicated. The allergen component is a bit open-ended. We restrict it right now to nickel and latex until more is known. So one thing we know is any chemical can be made into an allergen, and that makes life difficult. So we have to stay with known ones, and that's actually even harder than the CMR. So we have to sort of ring fence when we talk allergens, because the biocompatibility test doesn't do allergens. So you have to ring fence it. The allergen side of MDR is much harder, but the CMR side, we focus on the ones that are applicable. And the thing, if it's a category 1 CMR that's likely to be in products, it would be REACH SVHC for the most part, because that's how they're regulated broadly. You can test large equipment, potentially comply with Korean RoHS. Absolutely. We do definitely do that. It's quite an interesting project sometimes. It's basically EU RoHS test report at the end, or technical file. Really straightforward. We do that quite a bit. It's relatively straightforward compared to a lot of other things. How do you address high or low risk material? Any guidance? Use bomb check information, JIG guidance. Those are cool. We have a lot more than everybody else. We do tremendous. We do well over 1,000 products a year, tremendous amount of information. So what are low and high risk, our common locations work that we do is based on is a lot of experience. What have we found? What has industry declared? And it has to be reasonably tangible. It has to be attributable. So we do put in the statements, the evaluations, what the limit of risk is in terms of what the basis of the declaration. And high and low risk, it's not perfect, but it's, I'd say, vastly superior probably to anyone else's. And it's very much, and it's continuously changing. Bomb check's got some good stuff in it, but our stuff is our JIG, but I would say a lot of that's outdated. We know a lot more about what's out there. So we have we process where we use our own high and low risk. We actually base it on the material. It's kind of funny. We don't actually go into a product and ask where phthalates are. We find out what the material it is and figure out if it's high risk of having a declarable. Thank you for the questions. I think that's it. Kind of went over time. It's kind of my thing. Everybody who registered will receive a copy of the slides, and should be recording. This one I think has the whole Q&A, which hopefully can play back in slow motion. Let's go on a bit fast there. I was trying to stay under time, but that might not have been helpful. Again, if you need help, the on-site is superb. It's great bite size. But when in doubt, send us a product we can do it for you. And definitely, unless there's a specific need for it, start with example products. Learn from it. Expand across it. It also gives you more motivation. Do one product, you find out this. It's easier to show the management, look, we have this problem. I have to do this for a reason. It's more tangible. That's great hosting everyone again, and I look forward to hosting everyone again soon.